Thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you, Kelly. You know, we've been friends for a long time in this work where we're fighting against injustice every day of our lives. It feels sometimes like the friends and the family that we make are the people that we are fighting and building with because it is every single day, right? It is 24/7. I always say that injustice isn't 9 to 5. And so it's not a job, it's a life. And so it has been an honor for me to be able to be in that life with you as a warrior for our communities. To everyone who's in the audience, I want to say ashe, ashe, ashe. I know that I am speaking to the choir. You don't give up a Saturday morning unless you believe in something and want to engage in self and collective transformation. I'm excited that Staten Island is talking about environmental justice and about climate justice. And I'm excited that the leadership is coming from the front line. It is extremely important for people to understand that environmental justice is not just about the disparate impact of environmental burdens on communities of color, but it is also about leadership, the fact that we speak for ourselves. And I am part of the climate justice movement, and climate justice is a movement that comes out of the environmental justice movement. We were fighting against the siting of power plants, the siting of waste transfer stations, the polluting infrastructure that is responsible for our communities to have asthma, upper respiratory disease, and all of those things. And if you open the books, you may think that literally this starts in the 70s, that it starts as a movement at that time. But this issue, this thing that we call environmental racism, that literally starts in the slave quarters. It starts when our ancestors don't have access to good food, where literally petrochemical industries start being built around freed Black communities, right? It starts with bad food, with bad healthcare, with all of the things that come from our extraction as people who are descendants of enslavement and colonialism. So, you know, when we talk about climate justice is the movement that's looking forward and thinking about how do we move away from extraction to a renewable and regenerative economy. And the climate justice movement operates at the intersection of racial and social rights, environmental and economic justice. It focuses on the roots of climate change and calls for a transformation to a just, sustainable, and community-led economy. And language matters. So when people talk about sustainability without justice, you can't have sustainability without racial justice being at the center. And so without racial justice being at the center, it is not climate justice. And the language, you know, the language gets appropriated, like hip hop, like everything that we create gets appropriated by the privileged and repurposed to soothe and serve their needs. And this is different. This justice actually means something. You can't just slap it on. It means that the solutions have to be centered on racial justice and that they have to be led by the people impacted. And I'm really honored to be part of a matriarchal, leaderful, intergenerational, Black, Indigenous, women of color-led climate justice movement. And you know that we are in this moment of deep reckoning where we're confronting a crisis that was born out of the extraction of our land and the colonization and enslavement of our peoples. And we push back and have done so and are doing so successfully with multidimensional strategies that include organizing, base building, popular education, culture and arts, policy, infrastructure. We are shifting models of power, demanding co-governance, and we work to ensure deep democracy and solidarity among movement formations. And we say that because we don't live in silos, right? And so if there is a formation that is working on racial justice and another one that is working on housing, all of those groupings of people have to center a climate lens if they're going to be able to address the threats that are heading our way. So for example, people who may be working on police misconduct or extreme policing may not think that climate change has anything to do with them until they understand that there will be more extreme policing, that there will be martial law, and that whatever is an ism or an injustice in our community is going to be exacerbated by climate change. And so, we don't have to be convinced that climate change is a thing. I don't engage climate deniers. They slow me down. They waste my time. And so we know that we're not responsible for climate change. And we could look at Hurricane Katrina, Maria, Andrew, Ida, the floods and fires throughout the South to know that climate change is not only an angry child of a legacy of abuse, but that it is coming and impacting the communities least responsible for creating it. It's the product of uncontrolled greed and extraction, and its impacts don't affect everyone the same. The most vulnerable to its impacts are those communities and nations that have suffered the most from a system of greed and extraction: low-income communities, communities of color, the people of the global South. And as I mentioned before, it exacerbates the injustices that were already present when climate disaster strikes. So who are our communities, and how do we get them to engage in climate change? Our communities are the people who, because of a long history of toxic exposure, have health disparities that made them particularly susceptible to COVID. They have unemployment, experiencing ICE raids, displacement, extreme policing, and the violence generated by the everyday violence of institutional racism in all of its forms. So you add to all of that, to the legacy of all of those things that are held by our communities on a daily basis, generation after generation after generation, right? Because our bodies remember. And then you add to that the fear and the knowledge that we are going to endure recurrent extreme weather events, right? And maybe it's probably more likely that it's extreme heat that is going to kill our people. And so it is difficult to organize people and to bring them into this work when it feels so overwhelming, it feels so apocalyptic, and and people can feel really fatalistic. But it's important to know who the front line is and how we have endured and survived 500 years. And we are here and we're putting solutions on the ground. We're passing legislation. We have investments on infrastructure. We are building community, and that in spite of it all, we have the solutions, and all you need to do is look at what is happening across the country to really get a sense of how successful we've been, despite the fact that we are severely underfunded compared to big green organizations and white-led organizations. So because we know that frontline communities embody the deep and long impacts of environmental racism, and as descendants, and I have to say this, I can't say this enough times, because people act like, oh, they just cited an environmental burden in our community, it's environmental racism. But it's not new for us. As descendants of colonialism, enslavement, and extraction, we easily connect the dots between the root causes of climate change, the impacts on our bodies and our local environment, and the visionary systemic change that is required to move us away from an extractive economy. A decade ago, our communities were practically invisible within the broader climate movement. And this is what led to the formation of the Climate Justice Alliance, to ground the climate movement to make us the center of gravity, and to ground the climate movement in the struggles, realities, victories, and solutions of frontline communities. And we're now an alliance of over 84 members strong, from Brooklyn to the Bay and from Puerto Rico to Guam. And we are, as I mentioned before, matriarchal. And I want to share that with you because we reject patriarchy in the sense that we are led by people who believe in collaboration and not competition. So we reject those models of capitalism that pit us against each other, make the nonprofit industrial complex the model where people are chasing the dollars and not working on vision. We are working with each other in a way where we share resources, expertise, and information. And it is a model that is radically different and one that honors our ancestors. We are leaderful. We share leadership. In the 70s and the 60s and in the 80s, people would pick one iconic leader and that person would speak for a movement. In the in the climate justice movement, we are leaderful. We are leaderful and we're intergenerational, and we always have been. The environmental justice movement has always been intergenerational. So as you're hearing a lot about youth-led, and you're hearing about particularly white youth sort of stepping up and discovering the fact that climate change is a problem, for generations, young people of color have been leading all social justice movements in our history, whether it was the Black Panthers, the Young Lords, the Brown Berets, the American Indian movement, yet Black Lives Matter, Standing Rock, climate justice, the civil rights movement. Every movement has been led by young people who have put literally their freedom and their bodies on the line to make sure that we can breathe and that we have freedoms. And I want to flag that and lift that, because while I embrace people coming to this work and putting a spotlight on it, I reject any kind of erasure of the people who have literally given their lives to make it possible for us to be here. This is a nation that is indigenous. It was built by Black people, and it is sustained by immigrants. And so people using different kinds of models and information, who have access to lots of information, to resources, and get it quickly because of who they are, redefine the narrative. But the narrative is that there isn't all of our rights. The fact that we are able to even walk through the streets, we owe that to Black people. And so I want to make sure that I share that, because sometimes in this country, people come and they believe in the American dream. And the American dream is an extractive capitalist dream that pits people against each other, where people pull the ladder behind them without a nod and without recognizing that you can't even fight for your rights if it wasn't because of Black people. So being leaderful and being intergenerational, where one generation is not pitted against each other, where young people are pushing elders out of the way and say, I lead, and elders are holding on to power. When we are leaderful and we learn across generations, when we are working with each other in a way that is meaningful and respectfully honors that every generation has something of value to add to the conversation, and that the power and the brilliance exists in the collective, we are able to do an enormous amount. Those of us who are older basically are informed and shaped by new ideas that are fresh and necessary, and young people who may not know how to read the room politically will not get played, because we will be able to share them what it's like to walk into a room where the agenda has been set before you even walk in. And so those relationships are tremendously important. The other thing that's important is this idea of co-governance. And what does that mean? At UPROSE, what that means is that we've got all these people that are running for office that look like us, that come from our communities, and often they run on an issue that they became really well known for. It could be police misconduct, it could be housing, it could be immigration, but then they become elected officials and need to know 32 different issues. And then they have to negotiate with other people, whether it's the city council, the assembly, and they need to negotiate in order to get what they need for their district. And often what they're negotiating away is justice, right? And in the midst of that world, all of a sudden they are bombarded with lobbyists surrounding them with fact sheets and information and things that take them away from their accountability to the base. And so when we talk about co-governance, we talk about how the activists and the people who are actually doing the work in community are your brain trust, and that they need to be able to provide you with all the information about how climate shows up in all the variety of ways that it does, so that you were well informed and you were not played. And this is people who are in government, right? By lobbyists and other people who come with trinkets and shiny objects, that your accountability is to your people. And so we can't expect people who run for office to be knowledgeable about all these different issues. They will never have the amount of staff that they need in order to do that without us providing them with access to that information and that brain trust, so that then we can hold them accountable. And so that's one of the things that we do, because we kind of expect that they work for us and that they should be as knowledgeable as possible. So what do we do as a movement across the country? We use words that may seem like they're really simple, but they're not, because we're pretty freaking badass. We fight the bad, right? And so when we say we fight the bad, is we're fighting the fossil fuel industry. We're fighting people in government that compromise our rights, but we're also fighting big green organizations that come to our communities with false solutions, who really want to convince us that green hydrogen and carbon sequestration and all of these things that were actually created by the fossil fuel industry are solutions to the problems, without letting us know that what they're doing is turning our communities into sacrifice zones. And so, like Jedi warriors, we literally need to fight on so many different levels, because the threat is one where you've got these folks that don't live in our community, have not endured what we have, trying to make the decisions for us. So we fight the bad, right? Because these things are harmful to historically marginalized communities. And then our response is that we build the new. We're building economic models and institutions such as the ones with our power communities, with the Climate Justice Alliance. I can tell you that in UPROSE, we have launched the first community-owned solar cooperative. We are behind the launch of the first offshore wind work that is happening in South Brooklyn Marine Terminal. We have worked to decommission peaker plants. We helped pass the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, the most aggressive climate legislation in the country. And so we are about building the new and bringing the resources to make sure that we can operationalize it, so that a just transition isn't just aspirational, but it's operational. We are working to change the rules, and that means policy efforts and partnerships, changing the rules and anchoring the change of the rules and partnerships in what we call just relationships, and using the Jimenez principles as the path to getting us there. How do you engage in self-transformation? How do you build just relationships? Or are we going to be sort of fighting for the mic when literally our people are in harm's way, which is what happens historically, because literally if you do this work, you get a lot of shine, and sometimes our people become sort of like seduced by it and forget that the mic is just an opportunity to amplify our struggle and to move and to change the rules. And it's not about self, it's not about us, right? And then we work to move the money, and we move the money because we've been organizing to move the money from the old economy using both public and private vehicles to frontline communities. We know that most of the money that comes from foundations goes to white-led organizations, including organizations that get set up to compete with us and to do the work that we're doing. That there are people who are just feel entitled and supplant, duplicate the work that we're doing, come and pick our brains and ask us what we're thinking without compensating us, so that then they can set up a system of competition. And I can tell you right now that that competition, that culture of capitalism, is killing the planet and will take us with us. And so we move the money on a national level to make sure that the people most impacted have equity and access to the resources. And we challenge philanthropy because philanthropy has to start making decisions in a radically different way. And then we work to build the bigger we. And that is challenging, aiming to make sure that we are base building and organizing, and that our folks are not so colonized that they don't believe in leadership that doesn't look like them, that they understand that they have power, and that historically they have always lived within their carbon footprint, and that they have the solutions. And those of us who are in leadership, have to listen intently and honor that frontline voice, and use whatever education we had the privilege and the honor to have access to make sure that we are staffing community and that we are helping manifest their vision. And so we have to build the bigger we. And then we have to change the story and speak out against perceived unjust systems as the norm, and tell the actual story of what's happening. Those are some of the things that we have to do, and we are doing them, and we're doing them. And just like yesterday, between Joe Manchin literally saying that, you know, that really striking a blow against Mother Earth, and then the Supreme Court letting us know that taking away our right to breathe, right? The challenges and the threats are unbelievable. And I mentioned some of them, everything from the big greens that don't want to be aligned and don't think that they need to follow the leadership of people of color, but hire people who look like us to come into our communities and duplicate our work, to false solutions, to dealing with white supremacy and how that shows up. And so it is challenging to be in this moment, in this deep moment of reckoning, with all of the things that we have had to hold historically and all of the threats to our existence that exist right now. But I want to remind you that we have succeeded in Sunset Park. We've doubled open space, stopped the siting of power plants. We've sent 4 young people to Antarctica, 4 to the North Pole. We've held the largest gathering of young people of color on climate change since before, like we've been doing that for years. And so the work is creative. It is frontline led. And we've been able to pass legislation on the city level and on the state level. And now with the federal government and the fact that we can't depend on that because we are going and enduring a civil rights rollback that really sort of started when Reagan became president and started appointing right-wing judges, and then Obama and Clinton appointed centrist judges, literally like in the lower courts, right, in the circuit courts. So that evisceration of our rights didn't just start in the last few months. We're seeing it now bubble up and manifest, but this has been going on now for a good 50 years that they have been working to make sure that they take us back, and we're not going back. And so those of us who are climate justice activists can't separate any of those things with the fact that we are living in a time where we are going to be experiencing extreme weather events. I want to say for people in Staten Island, that, we are in Sunset Park, where we are in an industrial waterfront community. And we have envisioned a green reindustrialization of the waterfront, an industrial or green reindustrialization that will address climate adaptation and mitigation and strengthen social cohesion. We often reject the word resilience because resilience means to bounce back as if what was behind us was normal. And as a person of color, that what is behind us was never normal and was never good for us. It's good for people who have homes, who have a steady income, who have the kind of privilege that going back in time is something that they dream of. But we can't go back. We have to move forward, because forward means literally moving away from all of the isms and from moving away from injustice. And so even the word resilience is packed for us and tells us that maybe that's not the word that we want to use. So we talk about strengthening social cohesion and what are the things that people need locally to survive. And we know that the 3 things that are going to be threatened, which is water, food, and energy. And if you can imagine for 1 second getting up in the morning, and it's something that I talk about because I think about it every day, maybe because I've read the parable of the sower too many times, but you get up in the morning and you turn on the faucet, you drink water, you get in the shower, you put on the coffee, and one day you can't do any of those things. And climate change threatens to disrupt everything from supply chain. I know that a lot of the folks that have been doing the mutual aid stuff for COVID had counted on a supply chain, but imagine that that supply chain is no longer there. So this is the moment right now where we need to be thinking about how we are in relationship with each other. What does governance look like moving forward? How are we going to build just relationships? How are we going to engage in self-transformation to reject the kinds of constructs that have put us here in the first place? And how are we going to manifest and move away from an extractive economy to a just transition with each other in a way that is honorable and respectful of our ancestors and will put us out of harm's way? And that's hard to do, but it happens community by community, and I believe that it can happen in Staten Island. And you will be required, and you know that this is about transportation, this is about air monitoring and exposure to PM 2.5 and all the toxicity that lands in our lungs and in our bloodstream. You know, in places like Port Arthur, Texas, people have dioxin in their blood, literally. So this is not unique to Staten Island, and we don't engage in oppression Olympics, but it is an issue in Staten Island. And so whether it's transportation, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's investments on what happens if there are recurrent extreme weather events, what do you do with the mold that starts growing and actually lands in all your joints after there has been extreme weather? How do people get compensated? How do we make sure that our elders are safe? Our children who may have disabilities, what happens? It's so complex. But I can tell you that there are systems that are being played right now to strengthen social cohesion, community by community by community, and that there has to be investment in community leadership so that we can prepare our communities for a future that is already here. And I think, you know, my mom, who passed away this year, used to say to me, you can't cover the sky with your hand. And so I say that we can't cover the sky with our hand. We have to see it all in all its complexity. And then we need to reclaim and remember who we are and who our ancestors were and what they went through so that we could be here right now. And there is your power. That's how you walk in your power. And that's how you ensure that the next generation is able to breathe and that you have laid the path so that they are able to endure and thrive in the midst of climate disruption. So I want to thank you for hearing me today. I know it's heavy on a Saturday morning, right? I haven't had coffee, but I also know that what we're going through right now and what we will be going through if we don't prepare this moment is going to be heavier. So Ashe, and thank you for the opportunity to share my concerns, our challenges, but also our path to liberation and a just transition, and how the climate justice movement holds that space.